I still remember that night so vividly, as if the memory has been carved into the walls of my mind, a night that should have been warm and ordinary, with the sound of clinking glasses and children's laughter, but instead became the moment that exposed the cracks in my family like a house that looks beautiful on the outside but has termites eating it from the inside. And while everyone else seemed to enjoy their meal, I sat there knowing I was about to be stripped of dignity in a way I had never experienced before. My name is Patricia Caldwell, but everyone calls me Patty, and I am 64 years old. And until that evening, I thought I was just trying to survive quietly in my son's house, keeping the peace, helping with the children, and staying out of the way. But I had no idea that the moment was coming when the balance of power in our family would begin to shift in a way no one could have predicted. And as I share this with you now, it would mean a lot if you show your support with a like and a comment, so I know these stories matter. The smell of roasted chicken mixed with garlic butter and thyme still lingers in my memory, but it wasn't comforting the way Sunday dinners with my late husband Tom once were. It felt heavy, almost suffocating, because instead of joy, it carried tension. And I remember sitting across from Amanda, my daughter-in-law, watching her lift her wine glass with a confidence that almost sparkled in the candlelight. And as she smiled at the guests, I had the unsettling feeling that I was not part of this family gathering, but rather a piece of furniture, tolerated but unnoticed. When Amanda suddenly turned to me with that sharp glint in her eye and raised her voice above the chatter, saying, "Find a job and stop being a leech," I felt a hush fall over the table, the kind of silence that isn't quiet but rather filled with judgment, with every pair of eyes shifting toward me, some widening with shock, others narrowing with satisfaction. And in that moment I felt the blood rush to my face, hot and prickling like I had been slapped, while my hands trembled under the table and I gripped my napkin so tightly that I nearly tore the fabric. I glanced at Matt, my son, hoping he would look back at me, hoping for a flicker of defense or even just discomfort. But he stared at his plate as if it suddenly held the most fascinating pattern. And I thought to myself that this was the boy I once rocked to sleep, whose fevered forehead I cooled with damp towels, whose small hand once clutched mine in crowded grocery stores when he was afraid to get lost. And now, here he was, a grown man, unable or unwilling to stand up for me against his wife's cruelty. Emma, my 10-year-old granddaughter, sat next to me, and I could feel her small hand brushing against my arm, as if she wanted to comfort me but didn't dare, and I caught her wide blue eyes darting nervously between me and her mother, silently begging for this storm to pass, while Jack, only 7, tapped his fork against his glass in a rhythm that betrayed his own discomfort, the metallic sound echoing in the silence, until Amanda snapped at him to stop, and he lowered his head in shame, though he had done nothing wrong. Amanda's parents, Marge and Walter, were seated proudly on her side of the table like silent judges, and I will never forget the smug satisfaction on Marge's face as she leaned slightly forward, lips curled, as if she had been waiting years to see me put in my place, while Walter simply folded his hands over his belly and nodded slowly, as if Amanda had spoken some universal truth. And in that moment I felt myself shrink under their gaze like a schoolgirl scolded in front of the class. Yet somewhere deep inside, another part of me quietly whispered, "Not forever." I tried to steady my breathing, the sound of my heartbeat roaring in my ears louder than the clinking of cutlery. And for a brief moment I drifted back in memory to when Tom was alive, to those evenings when he would sit at the head of the table, his booming laugh filling the room, his large hand reaching for mine under the table just to remind me I wasn't alone. And the painful irony was that this was still his table, his house, his family. Yet I was the one being treated as if I didn't belong. So I let Amanda enjoy her performance, let her bask in the approval of her parents, let her believe she had finally reduced me to nothing. Because what no one at that table knew was that my story was only beginning, and that one day soon the very woman who called me a parasite would learn that the ground beneath her feet did not belong to her at all. The days that followed that dinner felt strangely heavier, not because the words Amanda had thrown at me were still echoing in my ears, though they were, but because every corner of the house reminded me that I did not really belong there anymore, as if I were a guest overstaying her welcome, tolerated but unwanted, moving quietly from room to room with the creak of the hardwood floors under my slippers, betraying my presence, even when I tried to glide like a shadow. I woke before everyone else, brewed the coffee, set out the children's lunches, folded the laundry, and made sure the kitchen was spotless before Amanda came downstairs. Yet the only reward I received was the subtle tightening of her lips when she saw me at the counter, a silent message that this was her territory, and I was intruding. Sometimes when I bent to load the dishwasher or reached for a broom to sweep the entryway, I would catch Amanda's reflection in the glass doors of the china cabinet, her eyes narrowing in mild irritation as though I were an employee who had failed to complete her tasks on time, and I reminded myself that this was my son's home too, and I had the right to exist here. Yet the truth was that I felt like an unpaid servant, someone useful when chores needed to be done but invisible when it came time to sit at the table as an equal. The children never treated me this way. Emma would sneak into the kitchen to help me stir pancake batter, and Jack would press his little head against my arm when I read him stories in the evening. But their warmth only highlighted the coldness that surrounded me whenever Amanda entered the room and claimed the air like a queen reclaiming her throne. There were moments when I allowed myself small escapes, moments when the late afternoon sun would filter through the lace curtains, and I would close my eyes, remembering the life I had with Tom, the way he used to whistle while fixing things in the garage, the smell of his cologne lingering on his jacket, the sound of his deep voice telling me not to worry. And for a fleeting second, I could almost pretend I was still the woman who had a place in the world, a woman who belonged somewhere. But then Amanda's heels would click sharply against the tiles, snapping me back into reality, her voice cutting through the air with commands about errands that needed to be run, or reminders that, "This isn't a hotel, Patty." And though I nodded politely, inside I could feel something shifting, something preparing itself for the day when silence would no longer be my only shield. At night, when the house finally grew quiet and the children were asleep, I would sit in the small guest room Amanda had chosen for me at the far end of the hallway, a room that smelled faintly of mothballs and old paint, and I would stare at the boxes stacked neatly against the wall, boxes filled with memories of a life I once lived and a husband who had promised to protect me even after he was gone. I did not yet know what secrets those boxes held or how much they would change my future, but I sensed it in my bones, the way a storm announces itself in the restless rustle of the trees before the first drop of rain falls. And while Amanda slept peacefully in the master bedroom, convinced she ruled every inch of this household, I lay awake, whispering to myself that a day would come when the shadows I lived in would no longer hide me, but instead conceal the plan that would turn her world upside down. There were evenings when the loneliness wrapped around me so tightly that I could almost hear Tom's voice drifting through the rooms, as if he were still there, leaning casually against the doorway with that half-smile that always told me he had been thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else. And in those moments I would close my eyes and remember how he used to make the whole house feel safe, how his laugh rumbled deep like a steady engine, how the smell of his aftershave lingered in the hallway long after he had left for work, and how I once believed that such warmth could never vanish. But now here I was, tiptoeing around my son's home like a guest, afraid to overstay her welcome, clinging to fragments of a man who had promised to shield me, even beyond his last breath. Tom had always had a soft spot for Amanda, and I often wondered if that was part of the reason she carried herself with such confidence, as if she believed she had always been his chosen one, his favorite, the daughter-in-law who could do no wrong, and I admit there were times when I envied the way his eyes lit up at her ideas, how he praised her ambition when she spoke about her dream of running a restaurant, how he believed she had the drive to make something remarkable out of nothing. But what Amanda never saw was that his admiration was never blind, that beneath his encouragement there was always a layer of calculation, because Tom was not a man who gave without a plan, and he often reminded me quietly that appearances were not the same as truths, that gifts were not always what they seemed, and that safety sometimes meant hiding power where no one thought to look. I can still see him at the kitchen table late at night, spreading out papers with his reading glasses perched low on his nose, the faint scratching of his pen as he signed his name, the way he tapped his finger against the wood when he was satisfied with the way things were arranged, and though at the time I thought little of it, dismissing it as business habits and legal details I had no reason to involve myself in, I sometimes wonder now if he tried to tell me in his own subtle way that the steps he was taking were not just for the sake of Amanda's dream, but for my own protection as well. It is a haunting thought, because back then I believed the restaurant was Amanda's alone, a symbol of Tom's faith in her, and a gift meant to elevate her in the eyes of the family. And I carried that assumption with me for years, never questioning it, never suspecting that the truth had been quietly tucked away in a folder, waiting for me to stumble across it when the time was right. When I lie awake at night and let my mind wander back, I can almost feel the pressure of Tom's hand on mine, the way he would squeeze gently whenever I doubted myself, whispering that I was stronger than I realized, and though he never once mentioned that a business, a thriving restaurant, had been legally placed in my name, I believe now that he trusted me to uncover it only when I truly needed it, like a secret key left hidden under the doormat of a house you once lived in, forgotten until the day you find yourself standing outside in the rain. And as I drift between those memories and the present, surrounded by the cold disapproval of Amanda and the silent judgment of her parents, I realize that my husband's foresight still breathes quietly through these walls, waiting for me to listen, waiting for me to open the right drawer at the right moment, waiting for me to finally understand that while Amanda believed she had been handed everything, the truth was that Tom had handed everything to me. It happened on a gray afternoon when the house was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a pause in the world, and I decided to occupy myself by sorting through the boxes stacked in the guest room where Amanda had pushed most of my belongings, boxes that smelled faintly of cedar and dust, carrying with them the scent of years that had passed more quickly than I realized. And as I opened one after another, lifting photo albums with cracked leather covers, fingering through yellowed greeting cards, and running my hands over the sweaters that still held Tom's cologne in their fibers, I felt both comforted and unsettled, as if these objects had been waiting silently for me to gather the courage to revisit them. The sun filtered weakly through the curtains, catching on floating dust motes that shimmered like small secrets in the air, and I sat cross-legged on the floor, half lost in memories, when my fingers brushed against the edge of a heavy envelope, wedged between folders of insurance papers and household receipts. At first I thought little of it, assuming it was another stack of tax documents Tom had forgotten to discard, but something about the way his handwriting curled across the front in his steady, deliberate style caught my attention, and I felt my breath tighten as I slid it free and turned it over in my lap. The envelope was sealed, but brittle with age, the flap barely holding, and when I opened it, the faint smell of old paper rose like a ghost from the past, carrying with it the unmistakable weight of something important. I unfolded the document slowly, my eyes scanning lines of text I could barely comprehend at first, and then the words seemed to leap out in bold clarity. My name, Patricia Caldwell, listed as the sole owner of Amanda's restaurant. The ink of Tom's signature stamped firmly across the bottom, like a seal of authority that could not be undone. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt, and I gripped the papers tightly, as if they might slip away if I loosened my hold, my pulse hammering in my ears louder than the ticking of the small clock on the dresser, and a shiver ran through me even though the room was warm. I whispered aloud without meaning to, "You never told me," and I felt an ache rise in my chest, not from anger but from a bewildering mix of grief and gratitude, because suddenly I understood that Tom had left me more than memories. He had left me a shield, a hidden weapon, a piece of quiet justice placed in my hands only when I was finally ready to see it. I sat there with tears welling in my eyes, not falling but hovering, blurring the words, as if even they could not bear the clarity of the truth I had uncovered. The irony of it all pressed down on me like a weight, and yet lifted me at the same time. Because while Amanda strutted around with her confidence, telling anyone who would listen that she had built her success from the ground up, mocking me for being dependent and useless, she had no idea that the very empire she boasted about legally belonged to the woman she dismissed as a parasite. I held the papers against my chest, the crackling sound of the stiff pages filling the room as if they were whispering their own secret, and I realized in that moment that I could either expose the truth immediately or keep it hidden like a dagger waiting in the dark until the perfect moment to strike. And though my hands trembled and my heart ached, a slow, almost imperceptible smile crept across my lips as I whispered to myself that patience, which Amanda always mistook for weakness, might just be the sharpest weapon of all. In the days after I found the envelope, I moved through the house with a different kind of silence, not the silence of someone beaten down or invisible, but the silence of someone carrying a treasure that no one else knew existed, a secret pressed against my chest like a heartbeat only I could hear. And though I still rose before dawn to brew the coffee and pack lunches and fold laundry as I had done before, every motion now carried a private sense of purpose, because each time Amanda walked into the kitchen with her polished nails tapping against her phone, or her sharp heels striking the tile as though she owned every inch of the floor, I would glance at her and quietly remind myself that she did not own nearly as much as she believed. I kept the papers tucked away in a drawer in my room under a stack of old sweaters, hidden in plain sight, and sometimes at night, when the house was finally still, I would pull them out and run my fingers over the embossed seals, tracing my own name with a mix of disbelief and awe, as if to reassure myself that it was real and not some dream I had conjured in desperation. Amanda continued her performance as though nothing had shifted, though I now noticed the cracks I had been too timid to see before, the way she lingered too long over bills that arrived in thick envelopes, the way her smile froze slightly when suppliers called during dinner, the way she snapped at Matt with sudden impatience whenever he asked about the restaurant's finances, and I began to realize that behind her shining facade, there was tension she tried to bury. Once, while she sat at the table bragging to her parents about how her business was thriving, I found myself watching her lips move and thinking how strange it was to listen to her claim a crown that legally belonged to me. And though I kept my expression neutral, inside I almost laughed at the irony, because she had no idea that the woman she dismissed daily as a burden was the true owner of her pride and joy. The power of that knowledge buzzed under my skin like electricity, not making me reckless, but steadying me, teaching me to savor patience the way one savors a fine wine by letting it breathe before taking a sip. I began to answer Amanda differently too, not in open defiance, because I knew better than to give her more fuel, but with small phrases that slipped from my lips almost effortlessly, words that seemed harmless on the surface yet unsettled her in ways she could not name. When she accused me of wasting space, I would murmur softly, "You never really know who holds the keys in this life." When she told me I would never understand what it took to run a business, I would smile faintly and say, "Some truths have a way of surfacing when you least expect them." At first she laughed, tossing her hair over her shoulder and dismissing my words as rambling from an old woman. But gradually I noticed her pausing, narrowing her eyes, and for a flicker of a moment her confident mask faltered, as though some tiny part of her wondered what I meant, though she quickly brushed it away with a forced laugh. I kept feeding her those little riddles, not to provoke her, but to remind myself that strength often comes not from shouting the loudest, but from knowing when to whisper at just the right time. At night, when the children were asleep and the house was wrapped in its shallow calm, I would sit with the documents spread on the quilt across my lap, the paper cool and crisp under my fingertips, and I would imagine the look on Amanda's face if she ever discovered the truth, how the color would drain from her cheeks, how her sharp voice would stumble over itself, how the smug certainty she wore like a crown would shatter into silence. Sometimes the thought filled me with a quiet satisfaction, but other times it frightened me, because to reveal the truth would be to ignite a fire that could never be extinguished. And though part of me longed for justice, another part knew that timing was everything, that Tom had trusted me with this secret, not to brandish it recklessly, but to wield it carefully, like a blade hidden beneath velvet. So I whispered to myself as I folded the papers back into their envelope and slid them beneath the sweaters, that the day would come when Amanda's arrogance would provide the stage for her own undoing, and when it did, I would be ready to step from the shadows and remind her that sometimes the parasite is the one who truly holds the crown. The weeks after I found the documents felt like walking across a rope stretched high above the ground, because while no one else in the house knew the truth I carried in my drawer, the energy between Amanda and me grew heavier with each passing day, as if some unspoken current connected us, and she sensed without proof that I was no longer as powerless as she believed, and she tried harder than ever to reassert her dominance. She began locking cabinets in the kitchen as if I might steal her ingredients, keeping receipts hidden in her handbag, whispering into the phone late at night when she thought no one could hear. And though she brushed me off with casual smirks and dismissive words, I could feel her watching me in quiet suspicion, her eyes narrowing whenever she caught me looking too calm, as if she couldn't understand why her cruel words no longer made me flinch the way they once had. One evening she announced, with her parents seated proudly beside her, that she was considering putting my things in storage so they could make better use of the guest room, and she said it with such nonchalance that even Matt looked up from his plate in alarm, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth, but instead of protesting, he muttered weakly that maybe it was for the best, and I felt a sting that pierced me deeper than Amanda's words because it was my own son surrendering to her will. Emma dropped her spoon with a clang, staring wide-eyed at her father in disbelief, while little Jack whispered, "But where will Grandma sleep?" And in that moment the room seemed to fracture, a family splitting across unseen lines, and though Amanda brushed it off with a laugh and claimed she was only joking, the message was clear. She wanted me gone, erased, forgotten, as if my very existence was an inconvenience she could pack into a cardboard box and wheel away. But fate has a way of playing its own hand, and not long after that dinner, Amanda received a phone call during breakfast that she tried desperately to conceal, stepping onto the porch with her voice hushed but sharp, and I couldn't help but overhear fragments drifting through the half-open door. Words like overdue payment, supplier delay, and legal notice, words that sliced through her perfect facade like cracks spreading across glass. She returned to the table pale and tight-lipped, snapping at Matt when he asked if everything was all right, and though she quickly regained her mask of confidence, I could see her hands trembling as she buttered her toast, and for the first time I realized that her empire was not as unshakable as she wanted everyone to believe. It thrilled me and terrified me all at once, because while Amanda thought she was tightening the noose around my place in her house, it was her own foundations that were beginning to crumble beneath her, and she hadn't the faintest idea how quickly the ground would give way. That night, as I lay awake listening to the creaks of the old house, I thought about the envelope hidden under my sweaters and how its quiet power seemed to hum louder with every confrontation, and I realized that Amanda's arrogance was leading her straight into a trap she had unknowingly built for herself. She was so intent on casting me as the parasite that she failed to see her own dependence on appearances, her desperate need to be admired, her reckless belief that she could humiliate me without consequence. And as I stared at the ceiling shadows moving across the plaster like silent waves, I knew the story was moving toward a collision, one that Amanda thought she was orchestrating, but which in truth was already scripted by Tom's foresight and by my growing resolve. She thought she was pushing me closer to the edge, but what she didn't know was that she was driving herself toward a cliff, and all I had to do was wait until the right moment to let her fall. It was on a Saturday evening when Amanda decided to host a dinner that was less about family and more about spectacle, because she loved to parade her so-called success in front of others, and she made sure to invite not only her parents but also a few of her closest friends who looked at her as if she were a queen in her castle. And as I helped set the table with Emma and Jack trailing behind me, I could feel the weight of what was coming, as though the walls themselves knew this night would not pass quietly. The dining room smelled of roasted lamb with rosemary and wine sauce, but the rich aroma did nothing to mask the bitter tension, and as Amanda floated from guest to guest with her sparkling glass of Merlot, her voice rising with exaggerated laughter, I felt once again like a piece of stage scenery, allowed to exist, but not acknowledged as part of the performance, until the moment came when she turned toward me with that familiar sharpness that could cut deeper than any blade. She raised her glass high enough for all to see and declared with a smirk that not everyone at the table contributed equally, that some people lived like shadows, feeding off the generosity of others, and then, locking her eyes on me, she said in a voice clear and strong enough to echo, "Some parasites don't even know they're parasites, and maybe it's time they learned." And though the words were cloaked in a playful tone, meant to amuse her audience, the laughter that followed was cruel and piercing, bouncing off the walls until I thought the room itself might split. Matt sat frozen beside her, his jaw tight but his lips sealed, his silence louder than her cruelty, and Emma gasped so audibly that even the guests turned their heads, while Jack leaned into me, clutching my sleeve with his small hand, as though to anchor himself in the storm. I felt my throat tighten, my heart pounding so hard that I thought it might crack my ribs, and I realized that this was no longer just about me. It was about the children watching their grandmother publicly humiliated by the woman their father refused to contradict. Marge, of course, clapped her hands softly, as if Amanda had said something clever, her face glowing with the satisfaction of victory, while Walter gave a slow nod that felt more like a verdict than a gesture of support, and Amanda's friends exchanged looks of glee, whispering behind their manicured hands. But in that cruel chorus I noticed something else. One guest, a woman I barely knew, shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her smile faltering as her eyes flickered toward me. And in that tiny flicker I saw the truth. Amanda's cruelty was so sharp that even her allies could taste the bitterness of it, though none would dare speak against her. It gave me a strange, almost defiant strength, as if the universe was reminding me that arrogance often carries the seeds of its own destruction. And in that moment, though my cheeks burned and my hands trembled, I no longer felt small, because hidden in my drawer upstairs was a truth that could silence all of them in a heartbeat. I took a slow breath, letting Amanda believe her performance had crushed me, lowering my eyes to the tablecloth patterned with vines, tracing the embroidered leaves with my fingertip, as if I were too embarrassed to meet anyone's gaze. But inside I was holding on to the envelope in my mind, feeling its weight, hearing the faint crackle of its papers as though they were whispering to me from their hiding place. I thought of Tom and the nights he sat with his pen, quietly arranging the world so that one day I would have the shield I needed, and I understood that this was the moment he had prepared me for. I chose not to speak, not yet, because I knew timing was everything, and I let Amanda revel in her false triumph, smiling at her guests with that hollow glow of a woman who believed she had broken me once and for all, while deep inside I whispered to myself that the curtain had only just risen and that the show she thought she was directing was about to take a turn none of them could ever anticipate. The air in the dining room had grown so thick with tension that even the flickering candles seemed to hesitate, their flames bending uneasily as Amanda lifted her glass for one final jab at my expense. And though her laughter rang out confidently, and her friends joined in with obedient chuckles, I sensed the unease rippling underneath, a faint discomfort that no one dared voice because Amanda always commanded the stage. My heart hammered against my ribs, yet the trembling that once betrayed me had vanished, replaced by an almost eerie calm, and as I glanced at Emma's wide, fearful eyes and Jack's small hand still gripping my sleeve, I realized I could not remain silent another moment, because their young minds were already storing these memories, and I would not let them remember me as a woman who sat quietly while her dignity was stripped away. Amanda leaned back smugly, her eyes glinting in the candlelight, certain she had secured another public victory. but she did not see me straighten in my chair. She did not hear the storm gathering in my chest, and she certainly did not expect that the woman she called a parasite was about to dismantle her kingdom in front of the very witnesses she had summoned to cheer her on. I rose slowly, the wooden chair scraping against the floor with a shrill sound that made several guests flinch, and I let the silence stretch long enough for Amanda's smirk to falter, for Marge's smug satisfaction to slip just slightly at the edges, and then I spoke, my voice low but steady, carrying more weight than any shout could. "It's a strange thing," I said, fixing my gaze on Amanda, "how people can build their lives on illusions, telling the same story so many times that they begin to believe it's true, until one day the truth steps forward and refuses to be silenced." A ripple passed through the room, some leaning forward with curiosity, others glancing nervously at one another, and Amanda's laugh came too quickly, too loudly, betraying the first crack in her armor. "Oh, here we go again," she sneered. The poor widow with her riddles, trying to sound mysterious. But I did not waver. Instead, I reached into the linen folder I had carried downstairs earlier, my fingers brushing the stiff edges of the envelope like a talisman, and when I placed the documents on the table and slowly unfolded them, the faint crackle of old paper filled the silence with the sound of inevitability. Amanda lunged forward with feigned amusement, ready to dismiss whatever nonsense she thought I had concocted. But the moment her eyes fell on the bold print of my name, listed as the sole legal owner of the restaurant, her face drained of color, as if the blood had abandoned her all at once. The room shifted palpably, her friends exchanging startled glances, Marge's hand flying to her chest as she gasped, Walter's brow furrowing deeply in disbelief, and Matt, my son, staring at the page as though the ground had split beneath him. Amanda tried to laugh again, but it came out as a jagged, broken sound. And when she reached to snatch the papers from me, I drew them back calmly and said in a voice that cut sharper than her insults ever could, "This was Tom's gift to you, Amanda, but he knew better than to leave it in reckless hands. He trusted me to protect it, and while you paraded it as your triumph, you never once realized that every brick, every plate, every drop of sweat poured into that restaurant legally belonged to me." Gasps and murmurs erupted around the table, one guest whispering, "Is this real?" while another shook his head in disbelief, and I stood firm, holding the documents like a torch that illuminated a truth too long hidden in the shadows. Amanda's composure crumbled as she shouted incoherent denials, insisting there must be some mistake, that I had forged the papers, that Tom would never have done such a thing, her voice rising higher until it cracked with desperation. But her protests only made her look smaller, weaker, as her guests leaned away from her outbursts, their once admiring eyes now wide with shock. Marge jumped in, slamming her hand on the table, calling me a liar, but Walter's silence spoke louder than her rage, his eyes narrowing as he studied the signatures he had seen countless times from Tom, and in that moment even he seemed to realize the truth could not be denied. Matt finally broke his silence, his voice trembling as he whispered, "Mom, all this time you owned it?" And his words fell into the room like a stone into water, rippling through the stunned faces. I turned to him, my voice soft but unshakable. "Yes, Matt, I did. I owned it from the beginning, and I kept it hidden because your father asked me to protect it until the time was right. And tonight, Amanda decided the time had come." The look on her face, pale, shaking, her lips parted but no words forming, was the very picture of a woman whose crown had been snatched away, not by force, but by the quiet power of truth finally unveiled. And as I stood there, in the glow of the candles, surrounded by gasps, whispers, and the crumbling pride of my enemies, I knew that everything in our family had just changed forever. The moment the truth left my lips and the papers lay spread across the table, the dinner that Amanda had staged so carefully as her victory parade collapsed into chaos, with voices overlapping, silverware clattering against plates, chairs scraping harshly against the floor, as her friends whispered in shock and stole glances at one another, their admiration for her unraveling in real time. Amanda sat frozen for a breath, her hand hovering uselessly above her wine glass, before she suddenly lashed out, her voice shrill and trembling, declaring that I was lying, that Tom would never have betrayed her trust, that the documents were false, and yet her words sounded hollow even to her own ears, bouncing off the walls without conviction. I stood still, my posture calm while she rattled on, and it was the stillness that silenced them all, the sight of a woman they thought broken now unmoving and unshakable, holding her ground while the self-proclaimed queen of the table unraveled in front of everyone. Marge was the first to rise, her voice booming as she called me deceitful, insisting this was some cruel trick to humiliate her daughter. But the panic in her tone betrayed the fact that even she could not ignore the unmistakable shape of Tom's handwriting at the bottom of those documents, a signature she had seen 100 times before on family cards and formal invitations. Walter tried to steady her, though his own hands trembled as he leaned closer to study the pages, his lips moving silently as he mouthed the words that confirmed the truth he did not want to believe. And when he finally sat back, his expression carried not rage but defeat, as if he had realized in that instant that the empire they had so proudly tied to their daughter's name had been nothing more than borrowed glory. Amanda's friends shifted uneasily, their smiles gone, their gazes darting anywhere but at her, and one by one they excused themselves, muttering apologies and slipping out the door, leaving behind only the echo of their heels on the hardwood floor and the taste of betrayal heavy in the air. Matt sat in silence through it all, his face pale, his hands pressed against his temples, as if the truth itself had split him in two, torn between the wife he had pledged his loyalty to and the mother he had quietly abandoned in countless small moments of cowardice. His eyes flickered toward me, filled with questions he could not yet form. But before he could speak, Amanda turned on him with venom, accusing him of being complicit, of knowing all along, of laughing behind her back with me, and her desperation spilled into rage as she knocked over her glass, sending red wine cascading across the white tablecloth like a spreading wound. Emma burst into tears at the sound of her mother's shrill voice. Jack pressed his face into my arm to block it out, and in that moment Matt finally raised his voice, not to defend Amanda, but to plead with her to stop, to look around, to see how far she had fallen, and his words hung in the air with a weight heavier than any accusation I could have spoken myself. When the room finally quieted, I gathered the documents neatly and folded them back into their envelope, my movements slow and deliberate, each crease in the paper echoing like a closing door on the life Amanda thought she controlled. I looked around the table at the faces that had once watched me with disdain, and I said with calm finality, "This house may not feel like mine, but that restaurant has always been mine, and from this moment forward it will no longer be managed by someone who cannot respect the truth." Amanda gasped as if struck, her body sinking into her chair while Marge's protests dissolved into incoherent mutters, and Walter stared down at his plate in shame. I announced that beginning immediately, I would be taking over full authority, that the next week a new manager would be installed, and though Amanda tried to sputter out another denial, her voice cracked and faltered as no one came to her defense, not even Matt, who simply lowered his head in silence. And in that final silence, broken only by the faint sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway, it became clear to everyone that the balance of power had shifted forever, and the woman they had once mocked as a parasite had become the unquestionable center of the room, the rightful owner of the crown Amanda had flaunted for so long. The days that followed the disastrous dinner unfolded like the slow unraveling of a tightly wound knot, each thread pulling loose to reveal what had been hidden for so long. And while Amanda stormed through the house like a trapped animal, slamming doors and snapping at anyone who dared cross her path, I moved with quiet certainty, carrying the envelope under my arm as though it were both a shield and a crown. And for the first time in years, I felt no shame in my steps. The phone calls began almost immediately, suppliers and staff reaching out in confusion as whispers of the truth spread through town, and I answered them calmly, my voice steady as I informed each one that I was the rightful owner and that changes were coming. Amanda screamed that I had stolen everything from her, but her words rang hollow, for she had no papers to wave, no proof to counter mine, only her arrogance, which had finally collapsed under its own weight. Within the week, I had met with Howard Klein, the family lawyer, in his office that smelled of leather and old books, the papers spread across his polished desk like weapons laid out for battle, and he assured me with a firm nod that every detail was ironclad, that there could be no challenge to what Tom had left in my name. It was with those documents signed and sealed that I walked into the restaurant Amanda had called her Empire, the staff gathering nervously in the dining room, their faces wary and uncertain, until I introduced myself not as a guest in someone else's dream, but as the true owner, their future now tied to me, rather than to a woman who had ruled them through fear and pretense. There was a hush, then a ripple of relief, as though they too had been waiting for the change, and when I announced that Gabe Torres, a respected restaurateur with both vision and integrity, would be stepping in as manager, the staff broke into cautious smiles, and for the first time in years that building breathed freely. Amanda arrived in a storm that day, her heels clattering across the tile like thunder, her voice rising with fury as she demanded they ignore me, insisting it was all a cruel trick. But no one moved to her side, not even Matt, who stood near the doorway with his arms folded tightly, his face pale but resolute as he refused to intervene on her behalf. She lunged toward Gabe, shrieking that he had no right, but he stood firm, pointing calmly to the documents pinned on the board behind him, documents with my name etched clearly in black and white, and when Amanda's eyes landed on them, her voice broke into a ragged cry, the sound of a woman watching her kingdom vanish before her eyes. She turned to the staff, to Matt, to her parents who had followed her in with pale, stricken faces, but every gaze that met hers was empty of the admiration she craved, and in that silence she seemed to shrink, her shoulders sagging, her fury collapsing into a hollow shell. I stood at the center of the room, the same woman who had once been laughed at as a burden, and I felt Tom's presence in the strength of my spine, in the calm of my breath, in the certainty of my voice as I said, "This place will no longer be built on arrogance and cruelty. It will be built on respect, hard work, and truth." The staff applauded softly at first, then louder, their clapping echoing through the walls like the sound of freedom, while Amanda staggered toward the door, her once perfect hair falling loose around her face, her mother pulling at her arm, her father unable to meet my gaze. And as they left, the weight lifted, replaced by something powerful and undeniable, the knowledge that justice had finally spoken. That night, as I sat in the corner booth of the restaurant now under my name, with Emma leaning against my shoulder and Jack giggling softly beside me, I looked across the room at the glowing lights and the faces filled with renewed hope, and I knew that the woman they had once called a parasite had become the true matriarch, the keeper of the legacy, and the rightful queen of everything Amanda had only pretended to rule.